Welcome back to another chilling episode of True Crime Untold Cases. Tonight we journey back to 1978 to a winter's evening in Yuba County, California, where 5 young men with intellectual disabilities vanished after a simple basketball game. Their disappearance would launch one of the largest searches in California history, only to lead to a devastating discovery months later. 4 bodies scattered across the wilderness, one man who survived for weeks in a fully stocked trailer only to succumb to starvation, and a 5th victim who was never found. What drove these friends to abandon their perfectly working car and venture into the freezing mountains? Let's dive into the perplexing mystery of the Yuba County 5. On February 24th, 1978, 5 young men from Yuba City, California, attended a basketball game that would mark the beginning of one of the most perplexing mysteries in American true crime history. Bill Sterling, Jack Hewitt, Ted Wire, Gary Mathias, and Jack Madruga, all between the ages of 24 and 32, piled into Madruga's Mercury Montego that evening, excited to watch their favorite team play. None of them could have known it would be the last time their families would see them alive. These weren't just any group of friends. They shared a special bond, all having various degrees of intellectual disabilities or mental health challenges, but they had found independence and companionship in each other. Bill Sterling and Jack Hewitt both had mild intellectual disabilities, but held steady jobs. Ted Wire lived with his mother, but was known for his gentle nature. Gary Mathias had been diagnosed with schizophrenia, but was managing well with medication. Jack Madruga, while also having mild intellectual disabilities, was proud of his car and his ability to drive. The basketball game at California State University, Chico, went as planned. Witnesses remember seeing them in the stands, cheering enthusiastically. They bought snacks, talked with other fans, and appeared to be having a wonderful time. The game ended around 10 p.m., and the men should have made the simple 50-mile drive back to Yuba City. It should have taken them about an hour. But something went terribly wrong that night. Instead of heading home, their vehicle was found 3 days later, abandoned on a snowy mountain road in Plumas National Forest, some 70 miles off their intended route. The Mercury Montego was in perfect working condition, with gas in the tank and the keys still in the ignition. There were no signs of foul play, no blood, no struggle. Just 5 sets of footprints leading away from the car and into the wilderness. The discovery sparked one of the largest search operations in California history. Helicopters scanned the rugged terrain, while hundreds of volunteers combed through the dense forest. The families held on to hope, but as days turned into weeks, that hope began to fade. The weather was brutally cold, with temperatures dropping well below freezing at night. How could 5 ill-equipped young men survive in such conditions? The first breakthrough came months later, in June, when a group of motorcyclists discovered Ted Wire's body in a Forest Service trailer, approximately 19 miles from where the car had been found. The scene inside the trailer was deeply disturbing. Wire had survived for potentially weeks, surrounded by enough food and supplies to have kept all 5 men alive for months. There were matches, heating fuel, and heavy blankets. Yet he had died of starvation and exposure, having lost nearly half his body weight. Even more baffling was the state of the trailer. Despite the abundance of supplies, it appeared Wire hadn't used them. The matches remained untouched. The heating fuel was unused. He had wrapped himself in lightweight sheets instead of the heavy blankets available. It was as if he either didn't know how to use these life-saving resources or was somehow prevented from using them. The discovery of Wire's body only deepened the mystery. Why hadn't he used the supplies? Where were the others? And most importantly, what had driven 5 young men to abandon a perfectly good car and trek into the wilderness on a freezing February night? As summer progressed, 3 more bodies were found. Jack Hewitt and Bill Sterling were discovered in the woods, about 11 miles from the trailer. Jack Madruga's remains were located in a different area, but Gary Mathias, the young man with schizophrenia, was never found. His disappearance added another layer of complexity to an already mystifying case. The investigation revealed more puzzling details. On the night they disappeared, a man named Joseph Schoens had gotten stuck in the snow on the same mountain road. He suffered a heart attack and spent the night in his car. Around midnight, he saw a group of young men walking in the darkness, accompanied by a woman. When he called out for help, they responded with silence and disappeared into the night. Was this the Yuba County Five? And if so, who was the woman with them? Adding to the confusion, the men had passed several occupied cabins on their journey up the mountain. These cabins had phones, warmth, and people who could have helped them. Yet for some reason, they didn't seek assistance. They continued their inexplicable journey into increasingly dangerous territory. The families struggled to understand what had happened. These were 5 young men who, despite their disabilities, knew how to ask for help when needed. They were familiar with cars and would have known to stay with the vehicle if it broke down. They had money in their pockets and would have known to use the supplies in the trailer. Nothing about their actions aligned with their known behaviors and capabilities. Law enforcement investigated various theories. Was there foul play involved? Had they witnessed something they weren't supposed to see? Did Gary Mathias have a schizophrenic episode that somehow influenced the group's decisions? Or was there a simpler explanation that continued to elude investigators? The case took an even stranger turn when investigators discovered that Gary Mathias's expensive tennis shoes were found in the trailer with Ted Wyer's body. This suggested that Mathias had made it to the trailer at some point, but what happened after that remains unknown. Did he leave the trailer to seek help? Did he meet with foul play? Or did he somehow survive and start a new life elsewhere? The investigation also revealed peculiar details about the men's last known purchases. At a convenience store in Chico, they had bought snacks and soft drinks, enough for what should have been just a short journey home. The receipt showed the transaction occurred at 10:36 p.m., which aligned with their departure from the basketball game. But what happened in the hours that followed remains a subject of intense speculation. Forest Service workers familiar with the area were baffled by the route the men had taken. The road where their car was found, while technically accessible, was not one that casual drivers typically used, especially in winter conditions. It was a steep, treacherous path that even experienced mountain drivers avoided during snowy weather. This raised an important question. What compelled them to take this dangerous detour? The discovery of Ted Wyer's body in the trailer revealed even more disturbing details that investigators had initially withheld from the public. When found, Wyer was partially dressed, missing his shoes and jacket. The trailer's interior showed signs that someone had attempted to light a fire in a metal drum, but had failed. Several C ration cans were opened, but only a small amount of their contents had been consumed. Most mysteriously, there were signs that multiple people had spent time in the trailer, yet only Wyer's body was found there. The families of the men began to piece together their own theories. Jackie Hewitt, Jack's mother, believed that something or someone had frightened the men so severely that they felt compelled to flee into the wilderness. She pointed to her son's history of being easily influenced by others and suggested that perhaps the group had witnessed something they weren't supposed to see. Gary Mathias's stepfather, Merle Mathias, focused on the possibility that his stepson's schizophrenia played a role in the tragedy. While Gary had been stable on his medication, he had experienced episodes in the past where he became paranoid and confused. However, this theory failed to explain why the other 4 men, who had no history of paranoid behavior, would follow him into such dangerous conditions. The search area was expanded multiple times over the following years, but no trace of Gary Mathias was ever found. Unlike the other victims, whose remains showed evidence of exposure and starvation, Mathias simply vanished. This led some investigators to propose that he might have been the key to understanding what really happened that night. Local law enforcement received numerous tips and potential sightings of Mathias in the years following the incident. Some claimed to have seen him in nearby towns, while others reported encountering a man matching his description as far away as Oregon and Nevada. Each lead was investigated, but none provided concrete evidence of his fate. The Joseph Shon sighting became increasingly significant as investigators tried to reconstruct the timeline. Shons had been absolutely certain about seeing a woman with the group, yet no evidence of a female presence was ever found. Some theorized that the stress of his heart attack might have affected his perception, while others suggested that the woman could have been key to understanding why the men left their car. The terrain itself posed another puzzling aspect of the case. The distance between the abandoned car and the trailer where Vaya's body was found was nearly 20 miles through difficult mountain terrain. For 5 men, some with physical limitations, to cover this distance in winter conditions seemed almost impossible. Yet somehow, at least some of them had made it. The food supply in the trailer became another focus of investigation. The facility was stocked with enough provisions to feed all 5 men for several months, including dozens of sea ration packs, packets of dehydrated food, sugar, matches, and cooking supplies. There was also a propane heating system and multiple heavy blankets. Yet evidence suggested that very little of these supplies had been utilized. This particular detail haunted the families most of all. Ted Wire had starved to death surrounded by food. He had frozen while wrapped in light sheets with heavy blankets within arm's reach. The psychological implications were devastating. What state of mind must he have been in to not use these life-saving resources? Experts in survival psychology were consulted, and they suggested that extreme panic or confusion might have prevented the men from thinking clearly about their situation. The combination of cold, fear, and possible group dynamics could have created a situation where rational decision-making became impossible. The investigation also revealed that none of the men were dressed appropriately for the weather conditions they encountered. They had left for a basketball game on what had been a relatively mild evening in Yuba City, wearing light jackets and casual shoes. They hadn't packed any additional clothing or supplies, suggesting they had no intention of traveling to the mountains that night. As years passed, the case began to take on almost mythical status in the region. Local residents spoke of strange lights in the mountains on the night the men disappeared. Others reported unusual military activity in the area during that period, though no official records supported these claims. The lack of concrete answers led to increasingly elaborate theories about what might have happened. The families of the Yuba County 5 were left with an especially cruel form of grief. Not only had they lost their loved ones, but they were denied any real understanding of why or how it happened. The evidence seemed to point in multiple directions simultaneously, suggesting both rational and irrational behaviors, both careful planning and panic-driven decisions. The case of the Yuba County 5 continued to generate new theories and investigations well into the following decades. One particularly compelling aspect that investigators revisited was the timeline of events at the trailer where Ted Wire was found. Based on his physical condition and the state of decomposition, medical experts estimated he had survived for up to 8 to 13 weeks after the group's disappearance. This meant he had been alive well into April or even early May. The implications of this timeline were staggering. While his companions were presumably dead or lost in the wilderness, Vaya had endured alone in that trailer for months. The psychological trauma he must have experienced is unimaginable. Investigators found evidence that he had tried to keep track of time by making marks on the walls, though these became erratic and eventually stopped. Further analysis of the trailer revealed other disturbing details that hadn't been initially reported. There were signs that someone had attempted to create a makeshift bed using old newspapers and facility documents. Multiple sets of fingerprints were found throughout the space, confirming that at least several of the men had made it to the trailer. But why had they separated? And why had Vaya, who was physically the largest and strongest of the group, been the one left behind? The families commissioned their own investigations over the years, hiring private detectives who uncovered new details about the hours immediately following the basketball game. A waitress at a local diner came forward years later, remembering serving a group of men matching their description around midnight. According to her account, they were in good spirits and talking about taking the scenic route home. This new information suggested that their deviation from the direct route might have been intentional, at least initially. The question of Gary Mathias's tennis shoes remained one of the most puzzling elements of the case. Found neatly placed in the trailer, they appeared to have been deliberately removed rather than lost. Some investigators theorized that Mathias might have given them to Vaya for additional warmth, but this didn't explain why they weren't being worn when Vaya's body was discovered. The shoes became a symbol of the case's many contradictions, a simple object that suggested both rational care for a friend and inexplicable abandonment. Weather records from that period revealed another crucial detail that had been overlooked in the initial investigation. The night the men disappeared, there had been an unusual weather phenomenon known as a temperature inversion, where warm air trapped cold air near the ground, creating thick fog banks in the mountains. This could explain why the men might have become disoriented, but it didn't account for their decision to leave the safety of their car. The location of the other bodies also painted a mysterious picture. The remains of Jack Hewitt and Bill Sterling were found relatively close to each other, suggesting they had stayed together until the end. Jack Madruga's body, found in a different area, indicated he had separated from the group at some point. The distribution of the bodies suggested that the men had split up, perhaps to seek help, but the reason for this decision remained unclear. Local wilderness experts who studied the case pointed out that the men had actually traveled uphill from where their car was stranded, moving deeper into the wilderness rather than toward civilization. This counterintuitive choice suggested either extreme disorientation or some compelling reason to move away from potential safety. The experts noted that even experienced hikers would have struggled with the terrain and conditions the men encountered. The Joseph Shon sighting took on new significance when cold case investigators reopened the file in the 1990s. They discovered that several other drivers had reported picking up a female hitchhiker in the area during that period. While none of these accounts could be definitively linked to the case, they suggested the possibility that an unknown person might have influenced the men's decisions that night. The families of the men eventually came to different conclusions about what had happened. Ted Vaya's mother believed until her death that the men had been frightened into the wilderness by something they had witnessed. The Madruga family maintained that their son, being the most experienced driver, would never have willingly taken that mountain road without a compelling reason. The Mathias family never gave up hope that Gary might still be alive somewhere, though as decades passed, this seemed increasingly unlikely. The case sparked significant changes in how law enforcement handled missing persons cases involving individuals with disabilities. New protocols were established for search and rescue operations, and training programs were developed to help first responders better understand how different mental health conditions might affect behavior in crisis situations. Forensic psychologists who studied the case suggested that the group's dynamics might have played a crucial role in their fate. With their varying levels of disability and dependency on each other, they might have made decisions as a group that none of them would have made individually. This groupthink theory became an important consideration in understanding similar cases involving vulnerable adults. The Forest Service trailer where Via's body was found became a sort of unofficial memorial site. Though it was eventually demolished in the late 1980s, visitors to the area still leave small tokens of remembrance. The site serves as a reminder of how 5 young men, who had found friendship despite their challenges, met with tragedy in the wilderness for reasons we may never fully understand. As the case approaches its 5th decade, it continues to challenge our assumptions about human behavior in crisis situations. The Yuba County 5 remains one of those rare mysteries where the discovery of most of the victims only deepened the questions surrounding their fate. Their story serves as a haunting reminder that sometimes, even with substantial physical evidence, the truth can remain frustratingly out of reach. The legacy of the Yuba County 5 extends beyond the immediate tragedy. It raises important questions about vulnerability, group dynamics, and the thin line between rational and irrational behavior in extreme situations. Each new generation of investigators brings fresh perspectives to the case, but the fundamental mystery remains. What drove 5 young men to abandon safety for a journey into the wilderness that would claim their lives?